Mechanics stood frozen beneath the towering silhouette of the captured Lancaster, their breath hanging in the cold Baltic air of Travemünde on the morning of June 10, 1944. 4 days earlier, Allied soldiers had stormed the beaches of Normandy. Germany's future was collapsing hundreds of miles away, yet every eye on this airfield was fixed on one British bomber. Would it fly? Or would it reveal another secret the Luftwaffe had failed to understand? Lurch was not easily impressed. As chief test pilot at Germany's premier flight evaluation center, he had flown dozens of captured Allied aircraft. Every flight was an interrogation. Every rivet told a story. Every cockpit exposed the philosophy of an enemy nation. Standing beneath the Lancaster, he felt something unexpected. The proportions were familiar. The fuselage looked strangely recognizable. The cockpit placement. The massive bomb bay stretching beneath the aircraft. Then memory connected the pieces. This wasn't an entirely new machine. It was a Manchester. Or rather, what the Manchester had become. To most German engineers, the Avro Manchester represented failure. Intelligence files had watched it arrive in Royal Air Force service, with promise and leave under a cloud of mechanical disasters. Twin Rolls-Royce Vulture engines failed so frequently that crews feared their own aircraft as much as German fighters. Germany had quietly crossed it off the list. Failed design. Dead end. Rebuilt into the finest heavy bomber Britain had ever produced. Lurch walked slowly around the wing, studying every modification. The span had been increased. 2 more engines had appeared. Structural changes blended almost invisibly into the original airframe. Someone had refused to abandon a failure. That realization disturbed him far more than the aircraft itself. To understand why, the story begins years before either bomber ever flew, not with war, but with an engineering decision that seemed perfectly logical. In 1936, Britain's Air Ministry issued specification P-1336-EH. They wanted a fast twin-engine bomber, carrying an enormous bomb load over long distances. Every manufacturer understood the challenge. Power was everything. On paper, it looked brilliant. The Vulture combined two V12 engines into a single X-24 design driving one propeller. 24 cylinders promised extraordinary horsepower, without the drag penalty of 4 separate engines. Less drag, less weight, greater efficiency. Every engineer across Europe admired the mathematics. What nobody yet understood was that engines do not fight wars on paper. The Manchester entered service in late 1940. Almost immediately, reality declared war on theory. Bearings failed. Connecting rods shattered. Coolant systems collapsed. Entire engines destroyed themselves from the inside out. Pilots stopped wondering whether enemy fighters would find them. They wondered which engine would fail first. Night after night, crews climbed aboard an aircraft whose greatest threat often sat inches ahead of them, inside its own nacelles. One wireless operator later admitted that flying over Germany did not frighten him nearly as much as converting onto the Manchester. That sentence says everything statistics cannot. Yet numbers tell their own story. Only about 200 Manchesters would ever be built. Operational losses mounted rapidly. Ground crews replaced bearings almost continuously. Entire squadrons watched aircraft disappear because mechanical optimism had collided with physical reality. Rolls-Royce finally made a painful decision. The Vulture would die. Many companies would have buried the airplane alongside its engine. Roy Chadwick refused. He did something psychologically remarkable. Where everyone else saw one broken bomber, Chadwick saw 2 different things. The engine had failed. The aircraft had not. The fuselage remained strong. The landing gear worked. The structure was sound. Most importantly, the enormous unobstructed bomb bay, originally designed around abandoned torpedo requirements, was unlike anything else flying. What if we've been blaming the wrong part? The answer required abandoning pride before abandoning metal. Rather than defend earlier decisions, Chadwick protected the future. He extended the wings, removed the vultures, installed for Merlin engines already proving themselves in Spitfires and Hurricanes. The decision sounds obvious today. It was anything but. Factories were already committed. Production lines were running. Contracts existed. Governments dislike admitting mistakes almost as much as engineers do. Yet Britain's wartime system possessed one unusual strength. It tolerated revision. Not perfectly, but enough. The redesigned aircraft flew only months later. At first it was called the Manchester Mark III. Soon everyone simply called it. The bomber climbed smoothly into the night carrying a heavier load than its predecessor had ever managed. Ground crews noticed something else. Pilots returned smiling. Not because war had become easier. Because they finally trusted the airplane carrying them into it. Trust cannot be measured in horsepower. It exists only inside human minds. And once earned, it changes everything. The Lancaster rapidly became the backbone of our IF bomber command. Its enormous uninterrupted bomb bay, once considered unnecessarily oversized, became its greatest strategic advantage. Later it would carry the Tallboy earthquake bomb, then the gigantic Grand Slam. Weapons literally impossible for most other bombers to accommodate. An obsolete design requirement from 1936 had unexpectedly shaped the future. History often hides inside accidents. Meanwhile, across Europe, German engineers faced a disturbingly familiar problem. Fewer engine nacelles, lower drag, greater speed. Instead of 4 independent engines, designers coupled pairs together to drive single propellers. Again, the mathematics looked elegant. Again, reality objected. Heat accumulated inside crowded engine compartments. Fuel leaked. Maintenance became a nightmare. Crews gave the aircraft a cruel nickname, the Reichsleiter. Aircraft burned so frequently that many airmen feared taking off more than facing enemy fighters. Engineers understood the problem. Pilots understood the problem. Production managers understood the problem. But understanding and changing are different things. Inside Germany's wartime bureaucracy, requirements hardened into doctrine. Changing course implied earlier decisions had been wrong. So the system defended the requirement instead of rescuing the aircraft. Engineers proposed for separate engines. Studies multiplied. Meetings continued. Meanwhile, bombers kept burning. The psychological difference between Britain and Germany became increasingly stark. Britain asked, "What survives if we don't?" One question rewards adaptation. The other rewards obedience. Neither nation possessed superior intelligence. Both produced extraordinary engineers. Both employed brilliant aerodynamicists. The battlefield, separating them, increasingly existed inside conference rooms rather than cockpits. Back at Travemünde in June 1944, Lurch climbed into the Lancaster's cockpit. The controls felt surprisingly ordinary. No revolutionary instruments. No miraculous technology. Just thoughtful engineering built around practicality rather than perfection. As he advanced the throttles, for Merlins answered with smooth confidence. Not flawless, simply dependable. Sometimes dependability changes history more profoundly than genius. He released the brakes. And for the first time, one of Germany's finest test pilots experienced what British crews had been trusting for over 2 years. He was not flying Britain's greatest victory. He was flying Britain's willingness to abandon one mistake before it consumed everything built around it. Below, German mechanics became smaller until they disappeared entirely. Ahead stretched hundreds of miles of occupied Europe. Inside the cockpit, Hans Werner Lurch found himself confronting something more uncomfortable than an enemy aircraft. He was confronting another engineering culture. The controls responded with remarkable balance. For Merlin engines pulled evenly without the vibration that haunted coupled power plants. The bomber did not feel revolutionary. Sensible. That almost irritated him. Great technological leaps usually announce themselves with dramatic innovation. The Lancaster offered something quieter. Common sense, applied without ego. As Lurch settled into cruise, he mentally reconstructed the choices that had created this machine. Someone at Avro had accepted public embarrassment. Someone had convinced officials to preserve factory tooling instead of starting over. Someone had admitted that years of investment had been aimed in the wrong direction. None of those decisions generated headlines. All of them demanded humility. Across Germany, similar opportunities had appeared. Heinkel engineers had warned about coupled engines before the He-177 entered full production. Flight testing repeatedly exposed overheating, inaccessible maintenance points, catastrophic fires. Evidence accumulated. Yet every report collided with an institution increasingly unable to revise its own assumptions. Nobody wakes intending to build failure. Failure grows when admitting error becomes more dangerous than repeating it. That was the invisible battle neither bomber crew ever saw. Roy Chadwick fought gravity. German designers increasingly fought bureaucracy. By late 1943, Heinkel finally flew a true for engine development, proving many earlier warnings had been correct. Experienced Luftwaffe officers praised its handling. Some reportedly expressed disbelief that a heavy bomber could fly so naturally. The compliment arrived almost 2 years too late. By then Lancaster squadrons had already crossed Germany thousands of times. Time, not intelligence, had become the decisive resource. The difference between 9 months and 5 years cannot always be measured in calendars. Sometimes it is measured in cities. Sometimes in factories. Sometimes in lives. None of this made the Lancaster invincible. Its crews understood that better than anyone. The bomber possessed a terrible flaw hidden behind its remarkable success. Escaping one was extraordinarily difficult. Its narrow forward hatch trapped countless airmen inside doomed aircraft. Statistical studies after the war painted a brutal picture. When Lancasters caught fire or broke apart, survival rates lagged behind several comparable bombers. Victory carried its own arithmetic. The aircraft delivered more bombs than almost any contemporary heavy bomber. It also buried thousands of young men inside its aluminum frame. Engineering always involves compromise. Every improvement leaves another weakness exposed. That reality became painfully clear during one of Bomber Command's earliest large minus-scale offensives. On the night of May 30, 1942, nearly 1,000 bombers crossed toward Cologne. Among them flew Flying Officer Leslie Thomas Manser. His aircraft was not a Lancaster. It was one of the condemned Manchester S. The engines refused to climb properly. Instead of reaching planned altitude, the bomber struggled thousands of feet below where it should have been. Lower altitude meant heavier anti-minus aircraft fire. The obvious decision was turning back. Manser continued. Why? No diary can fully answer that. Duty explains part of it. Training explains another. But beneath both lay something deeply human. Turning away would guarantee survival tonight, while abandoning everyone depending upon the mission tomorrow. Combat often reduces morality into impossible mathematics. The bombs fell. Then flak found them. One engine erupted into flames. Fire spread rapidly across the wing. Crew members prepared to abandon the aircraft. Someone had to keep flying. Every second spent holding level increased another man's chance of escape while reducing his own. Manser never announced heroism. He simply maintained control. One after another, crew members jumped into darkness. He remained at the controls. The burning Manchester eventually crashed in Belgium. His Victoria Cross recognized extraordinary courage. Yet there is another image worth remembering. He won Britain's highest award inside the very bomber engineers desperately wish to replace. Machines may fail. People still choose. 2 years later, another Lancaster carried another impossible decision. Flight engineer Norman Cyril Jackson saw flames spreading beside a wing fuel tank at 20,000 feet. If the fire reached the tank, everyone aboard would die. He climbed outside. Not after landing. Not wearing safety equipment. During combat. Wind tore violently across the wing. One hand gripped the engine intake while the other aimed a fire extinguisher directly into the flames. Imagine the calculation inside his mind. Not whether he might fall. He already knew he might. The question became whether remaining inside guaranteed something worse. The fire temporarily subsided. Then airflow swept him from the wing. His parachute ignited before opening completely. He survived with severe injuries and spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. He had already completed the required operational tour. He volunteered for one additional mission so his crew could finish together. War repeatedly strips away comfortable explanations. Sometimes courage looks spectacular. Sometimes it looks stubbornly ordinary. Back over the Baltic in June 1944, Lurch completed his evaluation flight and brought the captured Lancaster safely to Earth. His report praised its flying qualities. He respected what he had witnessed. Factories increasingly abandoned heavy bombers altogether, concentrating on desperate fighter production as Allied air superiority tightened around the Reich. The strategic argument had already been settled. Not by speeches, by production lines. When historians compare the Manchester and the Lancaster, they often celebrate technical brilliance. Approximately 200 Manchesters were built. More than 7,000 Lancasters followed. The remarkable number is not 7,000. It is 200. That was the cost Britain accepted before deciding failure deserved another chance. Every successful system eventually encounters something broken. Its future depends less on discovering mistakes than on permitting people to acknowledge them honestly. He rescued it because he recognized what still worked. Hans-Werner Lurch understood that the moment he looked beneath its wings. Long after the war, the smoke dispersed, factories disappeared, and governments that issued impossible specifications passed into history. The Lancaster remained, not as proof that Britain built a flawless bomber. It did not. Not as proof that Germany lacked gifted engineers. Instead, it endured as evidence that two nations confronted the same engineering disaster and answered it with two different questions. One asked how to preserve an idea. The other asked how to preserve an airplane. On that June morning in 1944, after shutting down the engines, Lurch climbed slowly from the cockpit and looked back one final time. The aircraft stood silently on German concrete, sunlight catching the form Erlenacelles that should never have existed if the original design had been defended to the end. It was still, unmistakably, the Manchester. Only someone had been willing to admit that it wasn't enough.